Hey, Joel.
What's up, Tim?
I don't get this movie. Crimson Jihad wants to blow up a nuclear bomb on an uninhabited island in the Florida Keys. Why don't they just do us a favor and blow up Jimmy Buffett's Margaritaville? It's like 30 miles west.
Tim, you're being kind of super critical.
Welcome to the first episode of our podcast, Super Critical, where we delve into the fun and sometimes nonsensical way pop culture covers nuclear issues. We watch a movie or a TV show and then needlessly overanalyze it. I am Tim Westmeyer. I am a nuclear enthusiast who has studied the history and policy of nuclear weapons and nuclear energy for about 10 years, and I've also been told I'm the annoying person you watch a movie with when it has these kind of issues as a plot device and won't shut up about why things are correct or not correct. One of those kind of people. But that's why I have my esteemed co-host.
Hi, my name is Joel. I'm a good friend of Tim's, so that makes me completely qualified to be on this podcast on a recurring basis to comment on each movie that we have to discuss. But otherwise, I am a completely ignorant layman, but well-intentioned and interested to discuss movies and all things pop culture, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons and nuclear energy in movies.
Great. Well, I hope you enjoy it. I know we did certainly watching the movies that we do, and the podcast essentially will try to look at a range of entertainment, mostly movies. That's where the good stuff is, but some TV, maybe even some books and music if we can find some good ways to cover these things. But we'll talk about the context of how these movies or films or whatever happens to be covers nuclear issues. What are the crazy parts, and more or less, what does this say about the world and how we understand nuclear issues? We'll wax poetic a little bit about this, and then hopefully we all learn a little bit more, and also enjoy some crazy nonsense. So today we watch the 1994 classic True Lies with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Jamie Lee Curtis, and the action star known as Tom Arnold. This is a movie that was directed by James Cameron, who we all know from Aliens, Terminator, and now the now forgotten Avatar. R-rated comedy, one of the first movies ever to have a more than $100 million script. So, pretty kind of a big deal. But it's also based on a 1991 French movie called, you're the one that actually can pronounce French. How would you go with this?
La Totale.
La Totale. Supposedly,
I'm also an expert in French, in
be,
addition to nuclear issues.
Good. That'll be what we'll draw on for all of our future French movies. But it's interesting, right? So Arnold saw this movie and he brought the script to James Cameron, thought it would be an interesting character study.
Right.
But
that's always good when Arnold Schwarzenegger comes up to you and is like, I think this would be an excellent character study that we should explore through film.
It's good. It did well. It was one of the top rated R comedies of that year. Made $150 million or so in the domestic box office, and it's also Ben Carson, presidential candidate Ben Carson's supposed favorite movie.
What?
Yeah, so it's left quite an impression on everybody.
It informs my foreign policy.
So it's an interesting one. The context of this is fascinating. It seems to be right at a good, interesting time in history. So it's right after the Cold War, but before 9/11. Concerns about loose nuclear weapons and weapons sold to terrorists or stolen from stockpiles was certainly on the mind of a lot of people, but also rising terrorist concerns about terrorism from the Middle East and some of those kind of things. One of the part of the movie references weapons stolen from MIRV sites in Kazakhstan, which is interesting because those three countries, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, right after the end of the Cold War, Soviet Union disappeared, it was only Russia that was pretty much left. Those countries had nuclear arsenals and delivery systems left on their soil. And not bad thing to wake up to, with Christmas coming right around the corner to see that underneath your Christmas tree. But these things, they were left with these weapons and trying to figure out what to do with them. So they had to sign an agreement that was negotiated after the START Treaty so this was, I think it was 94 when the movie came out, 92 when this agreement, the Lipson Protocols, were signed, and it wasn't until 1996 that they actually get all of the weapons back to Russia in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, their former dictator or oppressor country overlords, but be able to also have economic exchanges and some of those things. So this is a big deal. But I guess they didn't work that well because Crimson Jihad was able to steal some of those MIRVed weapons out of there, and then Arnold has to chase them after. So, Joel, why don't you talk a little bit about the plot of this? You, as an everyday man watching this, what do you take away from this?
Well, I think it's an excellent character study, as some have called it. We have Arnold Schwarzenegger, who I think has a long history of deep character analyses in his films, who is his name is Harry in the movie, who by day, at least ostensibly to his wife, is a mild-mannered computer salesman who just happens to be traveling around the world, going to various sales conferences, trying to sell what were advanced computers in 1994 using the latest version of Windows, which wasn't even Windows 95, I take it. In any case,
probably the latest dial-up modem. Maybe.
Right, exactly.
Might even be 48.
Yeah, blazing fast. But in fact, he was not a computer salesman.
Wait,
but
not a computer salesman?
No, nay. During the day, he and his compatriots walk into a secret office and proceed to try to save the world on a regular basis as your average mild-mannered spy. Jet-setting around to Switzerland and basically any other spot, trying to track down terrorists or any other threats to national security. I believe the name of his agency, we were always curious to go back, because we both hadn't watched this movie in quite some time, just to go back and figure out which agency he was in. Was it the FBI, the CIA, things like that? But no, instead it was a fictional agency. If I remember correctly, it was the Omega Force?
Omega Agency,
Agency, yeah.
The last line of defense.
The last line of defense. That was literally stenciled into the floor with the giant logo. I always thought, it's not very low key if you have the name of your agency, literally pressed into the floor.
They had to get through that long white hallway and the gun-toting secretary. Once
Right.
you get past that,
Right.
they have the holiday party stuff fired up on the board.
Yeah.
They probably have gold stars for the terrorists they take down.
Well, I wondered if they saved all their budget because everything's just white paneled in the hallway. They're like, well, we got this budget for the renovation for the office. Why don't we put the giant name of our secret agency on the floor,
Well, you got to have priorities, Joel.
Right, exactly. But anyways, I digress. So Harry is a spy. He's at the beginning of the movie looking into some suspicious characters who they think could have connections with terrorists. Fast forward a little bit, Arnold as Harry get on the case of some antiquities dealers who
Always suspicious.
Always suspicious. I mean, we're in the D.C. area. We see all these museum antiquities folks, and they're just up to no good. I mean, obviously. But we see Harry looking into some terrorist activities. One thing leads to another, and then all of a sudden they're getting shot at by some random folks, and they're on the scent of potential terrorists who we learn could be involved in the disappearance of various nuclear weapons.
They say 4 MIRVed weapon systems. I couldn't tell if they meant 4 MIRV missiles. I guess maybe some sort of mobile MIRV system. And MIRVs are multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. So these are missiles usually fired from submarines, but they also used to be fired from mobile launchers in the Soviet Union, as well as ICBMs, these intercontinental ballistic missiles fired from the ground in silos. These are things you fire one missile up, and instead of it hitting one target and blowing up one thing, you can have maybe 6 to 10 warheads independent in those. Now, it limits, roughly, they can't go everywhere in the world, but within a set area, you can have 10 targets independently launched. So that way, you have one missile goes up, you only have to secure one missile, and you don't have to worry about as many other of your arsenal being attacked. You could fire up one. It seems like it's a cost saver, but it was really difficult to maintain, and supposedly not well secured.
Cost saver.
Not really well secured at the end of the Cold War. If Crimson Jihad was able to grab them, although it sounds like it was someone that was in that area must have stolen them, whether it was diverted from some underpaid Russian commander or whoever it was, able to get their hands on him. So pretty scary stuff.
Yeah. So in the movie, they're tracking down these suspicious characters. They know these 4 warheads have disappeared. They're not exactly about the direct connection. But when they start getting followed and shot at a Georgetown Mall, they think something's up. Now, interestingly, this is where I think True Lies becomes an interesting movie, and I think why True Lies has lived on as kind of a beloved movie of, Arnold, at least as far as you rank his movies, is that almost by accident, Harry goes to his wife's office, stumbles onto a phone conversation that his wife is having with some mysterious guy named Simon. All of a sudden, he thinks she might be having an affair. And the movie really takes a complete turn from a typical Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie to one that's brokenhearted Harry, the computer salesman / spy who thinks his wife might be having an affair, who then proceeds to enlist his entire unit to spy on his wife to try to figure out who this guy is.
Yeah, they weren't busy with anything else.
Right, So literally we have a federal agency taking their resources off of tracking down terrorists with potentially nuclear weapons and reallocating them. It makes sense.
Wiretapping your wife.
Right.
We just found out that his child was stealing from Tom Arnold.
Right, that's true.
To be fair,
that's
who
true.
hasn't?
So, there are a lot of problems in this suburban D.C. household. So what could you do more to alleviate that than to have an entire federal team of federal officials tracking down your wife? In any case, so
this works out well for Simon.
Right, exactly. Played by the stellar Bill Paxton, I must say. I mean, in all seriousness, one of the best performances in the movie, I think, of Simon, who self-described nothing. Self-described coward.
Nasal lint.
Naval lint. Nasal lint would also be...
any sort of lint, really.
Right. I remember, that's one of the key quotes I remember from that entire movie, years later. I mean, we're 21 years since that movie?
Yeah, wow.
And I still will randomly drop,
Well, to be fair, that was mostly because people in high school called you that. So.
Right, that's true. I had an issue.
I'm sorry, we'll edit this out.
Yep. So they're tracking down the wife. They run into Bill Paxton. They realize he's not a major issue. We'll get back to the nuclear issues, I promise. And then all of a sudden, Harry and his wife are abducted by the terrorists again. So you've almost completely lost interest in these terrorists who you don't really know anything about or their motivations other than they're terrorists with guns, so they're doing terrorist things.
And fairly good at motorcycle riding.
Yes, that's true. And then all of a sudden they've abducted them. They take them to the Keys off of Florida.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they say an island off of Marathon Key, which is kind of right in the middle between Key West and the continental Florida.
Right. And then we proceed to learn that the antiquities dealer, played by Tia Carrera, if I remember correctly, has assisted Crimson Jihad with transporting 4 nuclear warheads.
Dun, dun, dun.
I guess we should know this is a spoiler alert. I mean, I guess we are doing a play-by-play. So
everything and anything.
It's assumed that this whole podcast is a spoiler alert.
That's how you really get in the weeds of this.
Right, exactly. They have transported said nuclear warheads through the antiquities that the antiquities dealer has transported from ancient Persia to the United States, which they decided, hey, let's go to Florida to move them of all places.
I mean, I recently went to Florida, the Florida Keys on my honeymoon, and when I was there was a lot of, coconut conch shells right next to the Persian artifacts.
Right.
It just blends well together. People down there they're wonderful. They have a lot of sense of culture.
Right. I mean, I'm not going to read too much into this, but if you're a terrorist and you're like, where should we go to plot our efforts to overtake the United States or whatever, and someone goes, let's go to Florida to do it, I'm thinking, that guy just needs some vacation. Why not just give him an extra 2 weeks, Well,
it's pretty, yeah, exactly. They're trying to get a double whammy, you want to...
It's like, Jerry, come on,
have
be
vacation
honest.
plus
Jerry, just be honest. Do you want to go to the beach? And it's like, no, we can do work. It's like, just take 2 weeks off.
Well, I mean, it's funny because they say that they landed on some sort of an island that is off of the Marathon Keys, but is still connected to the bridge by the bridge highway system.
Right.
But still 12 miles out, enough far at the end of the movie, spoiler alert again, when the bomb goes off, that everyone's okay. there are not any bridges that are like that. At least not that I saw when we drove up and down that a couple times. Seems like it's pretty far, but whatever. I mean,
but there's a rationale to all this.
Okay,
why they're on this island. So
Explain
as we learn, when the terrorist leader brings out Harry and his wife, that they have their 4 nuclear warheads. They're going to detonate one on this island to show, to demonstrate their power, I think was the quote.
Wait, sorry, real quick, just to realize this. He says in the movie that it's a MERV 6, which
Correct.
means that it has 6 warheads on that model of the MERV. A lot of times MERVs could have between 6 and 10, and they may not load all of them up onto that individual missile itself.
Okay.
So if there are only 4 in the movie, but it was a MERV 6, interesting, I wonder if there's 2 missing somewhere out there, so maybe that was the idea for the sequel. But
Oh, I thought each one was a...
That's what's interesting, because they said that they lost 4 MERVs in the earlier part of the movie.
Right.
But then later on, he says that particular warhead, Arnold says it's from a MERV 6, right. Which means one MERV. You alternate. MERVs are supposed to be about the reentry vehicles, but sometimes you'll say a MERVed weapon. Well, like a MERV missile.
Okay.
Like a MERV 6 missile, which is an odd way of saying it, but that's usually how it's described, as a missile that has 6 independently targeted reentry vehicles on that missile. So if there are 4 MERVs missing, that's 4 sets of warheads. I don't know. This is where the movie kind of goes, and it didn't really sure exactly what the details are going to be about, but sorry.
A movie being short on details, that's why we've got to be super critical.
Yeah, it's exactly what we're here for.
Right. So we're at the nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And we learn they're going to detonate one bomb in Florida while Jerry's on the beach.
I love how he says on this uninhabited island, because it's humanitarian purposes.
Yeah, to show our humanitarian side, which is, well, you've already shot a couple dozen people, but,
sure.
We're not that bad.
And about to undercut it when you maybe blow up Miami, but...
Right. But, details. They're still well-intentioned. Mm-hmm. And we find that the reason why they've brought Harry and his wife to the site is to validate or verify that they do have, in fact, nuclear weapons in their possession. So,
although, of course, blowing one up on an island would certainly verify that it works and that they have one. But
pre-YouTube, they still felt the need to record video. So you see a guy with an old school tape, video recorder,
trying to get very viral. Yeah,
right, exactly. So. So fast forward, they are able to escape. The bomb does go off of Florida. Arnold then goes off, does his action movie thing, stops the terrorists from exploding another bomb, I guess, in Miami. Mm-hmm.
The famous bridge is out scene.
The famous bridge is out scene. So I think generally we know how it ends, positive end for the heroes, bad end for the terrorists, as we see in all Arnold Schwarzenegger movie,
and a wonderful end for the marriage too.
Exactly. So maybe let's start kind of the in-depth discussion going back to when they first see those warheads pulled out of the antiquities. Mm-hmm. Tim, I know nothing of nuclear issues, and again that makes me qualified to be on this podcast. So I'm going to play the well-intentioned. Idiot here, and just ask you. So when they roll out,
I'm going to play the guy that pretends like he knows what he's talking about.
Right. So when they roll out these weapons, they're probably in the size of, I think we were talking like closest thing would be maybe a coffin size, like a large horizontal shaped rectangle box thing. They open it up, and then there's a great exchange with the terrorist and Arnold Schwarzenegger, who says, "Do you know what this is?" And he goes, "Oh, I know what this is." So Tim, from that, let's go through what Arnold says it is in that movie, and then what you picked up from your own kind of research into these weapons.
Well, it's certainly not a water heater or a snow cone maker, but although it is, the warheads do look a little bit like snow cones, just without or ice cream cones or snow cones, just without the juicy flavoring on the top, just kind of just the cone itself.
Right.
I don't know.
Nicely painted too.
It's nicely painted. Although I'm always wondering why they painted them. I guess for when they have parades and all that kind of stuff, you want to be able to demonstrate that you have a good sense of style. Well, so the quote is a Soviet MERV 6 from an S-22N launch vehicle. I don't do Arnold impressions. The warhead contains 14.5 or whatever they say kilograms of enriched uranium with a plutonium trigger, and the nominal yield is 30 kilotons. So I think it's funny.
This is a Soviet MiG 6 from that says 22N. Yeah, it's not good.
That's right. No, Arnold can't be here today. But it is interesting. So that description all put together, it sounds good because it's supposed to be the thing that convinces Jamie Lee Curtis finally that she married a spy. But it's a little bit of nonsense when you put that all together. Again, this is probably just movie talk.
Let's break it down. Let's get super critical here.
So the SS-22N, there was an SS-22 launch vehicle, but it really was never. There was a conventional version and there was a nuclear version, but it never was a MIRV system because MIRV systems tend to be what we call strategic. They're the things that are, and that's a little bit of a definition between strategic weapons and tactical weapons. There isn't a clear definition, but tactical weapons tend to be used in the battlefield. They're smaller weapons, smaller yield.
And you mean all tactical nuclear weapons?
Tactical nuclear
all
weapons.
Nuclear
here. Yeah. So tactical nuclear weapons sometimes are called theater nuclear weapons. These are the kind of things that you use on the battlefield. You want to be able to stop a tank battalion that's chasing you, or you want to be able to make an area unpassable for some sort of troops or movements and those kind of things. Tend to be smaller yield, tend to be things that aren't launched very far. They're not intercontinental.
Which kind of goes against, I think, from my perspective, that kind of goes against, I think, what most people, how most people view nuclear weapons, especially in movies.
Usually you see
where
some
it's
sort
always
of a missile.
like a world-ending,
Yep.
city-destroying, lights out, Terminator 2, Judgment Day kind of situation. Oh, another Arnold film. Foreshadowing
We'll get to
the
that.
next podcast.
We'll get
Who
to that.
knows? But it's interesting that, to get into that detail where you had smaller weapons and to think about how they were used, or at least theorized to be used.
Well, it's funny because they say it's from a Soviet MIRV, but they say it's the yield is, I think, remember the movie, it says like 30 kilotons. Well, that seems very small. That seems pretty small compared to what we normally consider to be for MIRV systems. For example, the bomb in Hiroshima that was used to end World War II, that was around 13 kilotons. The bomb that was used in Nagasaki, also to end World War II, that was around 21 kilotons. So the idea was, 30 is close to that amount, and I'm sure there might be some tactical nuclear weapons. There's different estimates about what the size of those are. They might be along the lines of those, but we certainly didn't fire those kind of warhead sizes through MIRV systems or these kind of large launch vehicles. Those tended to be much larger. Let's see here. I wrote a few notes ahead of time. MIRVs in at least the modern U.S. warhead system that were around in the 90s, for the U.S. they were close to between 300 to 600 kilotons. So pretty big. That's an example. That's the MIRV. That's the U.S. MIRV, the W-87 ICBM warhead, or the W-88, which we used in our submarines. That was around 475 kilotons. And Soviet missiles, in particular, tended to be much larger because their missiles weren't as accurate. So if you are trying to fire to hit something and you're not as accurate, sure where it's going to land, you want to make sure it has a bigger bomb, bigger explosion radius near the end. So those tended to be more around 500 to 700 kilotons range for that size. Tend to be maybe even larger than that, maybe even in terms of megatons. So it's kind of funny that they picked 30. I wonder always why they did that. It seems like near the end of the movie, it's on an island, and Jamie Lee Curtis and Arnold Schwarzenegger share a nice warm embrace and rekindle their marriage spark while in the middle of this,
in the shadow of a
nuclear bomb. So maybe if it was any larger than that, they realized, this would actually be a pretty big deal. Because it's funny, when the bomb goes off at the end of the movie, it's kind of not a big deal. There's no discussion about the fact that a nuclear
the world
bomb
is about to change.
The world is about to change. No one seems to die. There's no fallout. Everything's fine. The blast radius, the shock wave, you can see it, but it doesn't go out that far. They say they're 12 miles out, or at least that's the safe area.
It's okay, Tim, because Tom Arnold.
Got
everything under
he's
control.
got his bullhorn, yeah.
If the president needs somebody to deal with nuclear fallout, he calls up Tom Arnold.
I hope not. I hope he's not in charge of civil defense. But
that's an interesting point because, again, for the lay person who's in a movie theater or at home, watching the DVD or Blu-ray, it's like if it was 30 or 300. I mean, that's an interesting point. Would any average person kind of get that size distinction?
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because these are certainly numbers that are farther than we ever imagined for conventional weapons. Mm-hmm. Like when they first did the United States did the first nuclear bomb test in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the Trinity test is what the code name was. They did a test a few days beforehand. So when you say, 30 kilotons, what that means is 30 kiloton equivalent, like size of a conventional explosion, like TNT. Mm-hmm. So they did a test before that. They took 100 tons of conventional explosives, blew it up out in the middle of the desert, and used all of their calibration systems to scale it. Then they scaled it up when they did the Trinity test, and that's how they were able to figure out what the equivalent is. So when we talk about those kind of things, that's what that means. It's not a matter of like the amount of explosions that happen. It's
the conventional explosive equivalent
in terms of mass of the TNT. Okay. Right. So that's kind of what we mean by that. So the idea that 30 kilotons, that's 30,000 tons. That's right. A lot. We don't build TNT bombs that size. So to someone...
Except in Looney Tunes.
Yeah. Poor Wile E. Coyote. So that's scary stuff. So when people say 30 kilotons and they hear that, that sounds pretty big. But it's certainly not what we think about the kind of weapons that existed in terms of strategic weapons in the 90s. Okay. It seemed like it'd be not a waste, but it just doesn't have that impact that they were trying to go for when the Soviet Union wanted to hold U.S. cities or U.S. military installations at risk. 30 kilotons isn't very much because a lot of these things that they're targeting, either a U.S. missile silo, if they wanted to hit first before these weapons were used in Montana or Colorado, wherever we happen to have our missile fields, where they think they have our missile fields, those things tend to be hardened. They're under concrete bunkers. They're underground. We put them there specifically because we thought they'd be safe there. So then you have to make a larger bomb or a more accurate missile to be able to actually go out these kind of things. So that's why they tend to be bigger for that kind of purpose.
So here's a question then. If these were based in Kazakhstan, mm-hmm. as was stipulated early on in the movie by one of Arnold's compatriots, what do you think that device would have been used for? If it was a small, mm-hmm. if that was actually the size, and we could go back to look at what was actually housed in Kazakhstan. But I mean, what would have been the closest population center that it might have been used?
What's fascinating is that they keep saying that it's from a MIRV. So
right.
MIRVs aren't really used for like theater operations, which is what that yield would give an indication for.
Right.
It used to be in a lot of movies in the 90s and the 80s that are about nuclear things being stolen. James Bond, lots of these kind of things. Talked about suitcase bombs. Those mm-hmm. kind of things. Those are the smaller bombs because those are the kind of things that you would use. You would bring to a certain area and then launch it and fire it. There used to be, during the Cold War, there were army commanders when we used to have artillery that would fire the Davy Crockett system. Right. It was our artillery would fire a nuclear weapon. It would explode it. You didn't want to have anything that was too big because then the people that were firing the missile would be gone too. Yep. You essentially would have a lot of your own people getting destroyed. Mm-hmm. But there was army commanders that what their job was they would have a nuclear backpack, which isn't a size of a backpack exactly. It's about the size of a coffin kind of thing. It's pretty big and round, and they fire it out of an airplane. They parachute down with it. They set it up and they put it on a timer. And this is in the event of the Soviet Union having their conventional military, which was much larger than the NATO forces. If they were marching west, they wanted to set these bombs off at strategic locations. And then these people that do this, they hope that they can get out. Tend to be what they would do is they would jump into the water and swim to a submarine. And then these things would go off on a timer, and it would blow up that area. So that way Soviet troops couldn't march through there.
They could jump into a refrigerator maybe?
Yeah, maybe. We'll cover that.
Foreshadowing?
We'll do that. I'm sure we'll do that one at some point. Old Indy. Russia really has a lot of these smaller, relatively compared nuclear weapons, these theater tactical nuclear weapons. They have a lot of them. Mostly because they have tended to rely on them as their conventional military has fallen down. It has not been up to par as it was during the Cold War, whether it be economic constraints or just time and where you can put your money into. Russia tends to have to rely on those things as the United States, their rival in some senses, sees they having a much more modern and advanced military. They rely on the nuclear side much more than we do nowadays. So mm-hmm. it's fascinating to see what the mission of a 30 kiloton bomb would be on a MIRV.
In Kazakhstan.
In Kazakhstan, but Kazakhstan, I mean, it's sad because Russia considered itself in the Soviet Union to be the leader of all these various countries, but really they tested nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan. They didn't test them in Moscow. They didn't test them anywhere where the radioactive effects would affect their own individual citizens.
So So moving on, maybe from the conceptual, like strategic use of the weapons that have been discussed in the movie, let's talk more about, kind of let's get down to the brass tacks of, what these things actually looked like in the movie. Like we were saying, it's like a giant snow cone, or a giant ice cream cone almost.
Ice cream cone. Same. I mean, it's cone shaped.
Right. We said, is size of maybe like a coffin, like 5 feet tall or something like that. So
I mean,
let's talk about this.
They vary in sizes, but that's kind of. I mean, that's just funny. I mean, the kiloton
generally
size,
accurate.
Generally accurate. I mean, the shape's there. It seemed like the size is about right. I think they probably weigh a lot more than they actually seem to indicate. Some of these estimates for these warheads are around a ton, which is why you have to have such large missiles to carry them, because what they call throw weight, how much carrying capacity the weapons can have, along with other things that they use, like they call them penetrative aids or decoys, to use against missile defense systems. Like whatever they launch up, usually for the missile is called a throw weight. They tend to be pretty heavy. So they see like about 6 or 7 guys in the movie carrying one of these things. I mean, it seemed like most of the people that were working for Crimson Jihad were pretty big Arnold's weightlifting buddies. So it all seemed to work out pretty well. But I mean, it seemed like they got that size of that kind of stuff pretty right.
Now, how difficult would it have been, if these things were attached to these, bigger missiles? And, from what I remember of all the movies I've watched with nuclear weapons attached to missiles, they're pretty big. I mean, could that be done easily? Or, I mean, would you have needed, multiple scientists and specialists in order to get those off of, rockets in order to be able to transport them in small cases?
I mean, it's hard to tell because a lot of this stuff's classified, and I don't have a clearance. So that maybe probably just lost all of our listeners already. But one of the things that I found that are really interesting, and this happens in a lot of different movies, is they take something that's not a suitcase bomb or some sort of a bomb that's meant to be exploded at ground level by just holding it. They take these things that are from MIRVs, that are missiles. Like these warheads are designed to be put into space and come down and blow up either 10,000 feet above the ground, or 1,000 feet above the ground, or at ground level. I mean, these things are programmed into the warhead. So, and these are done to prevent unauthorized use, so that someone can't just steal a warhead
and turn
off
a
a missile
key and then press a button.
They talked about a firing box in this movie. Okay, look, I don't know.
We're going to get to the key in a second.
I'm sure that's a thing, but most of these things, and they talk about this stuff. You hear about PALs, these permissive action links that after the Kennedy administration, we put on all of the U.S. missiles. These are codes that you have to be able to program to turn the bomb on so that it actually works. It's to prevent things from being
Is this
stolen.
related to the football?
No, not really the football. The football will... The nuclear football that you're referring to, we'll talk about that probably in another episode.
Okay.
That essentially is it's to verify that the president, whoever, in the United States, it's the president, the secretary of defense, and then the represented delegates that are what's called the National Command Authority. These are the people who have the ability to authorize a nuclear launch. Okay. Now, it is not simply a matter of like you can use the nuclear football. You can't really use it to launch an attack. What it does is it allows you to communicate with the people
Verify
who
the
launch
people
it.
communicating.
Verify the people that are giving the orders. And then the individual weapons themselves have codes that you have to be able to access them so that the weapons themselves can be turned on, ready to fire. But not only that, these weapons are designed they have certain sensors on them that are to basically determine where they're going to be launched off and firing. So we talk about this. These are called the SAFE system, SAFF, safing, arming, fusing, and firing. These are procedures that a nuclear terrorist or anyone that steals one of these weapons, either be a rogue commander that wants to fire these things, they have an arming sequence that requires changes in altitude, in acceleration, and other parameters that the warhead sensors have to verify. Meant to be, basically, they have to be used the way they're meant to be used. So most warheads are not meant to be left on a timer and then left to go off, because that doesn't make a lot of sense from a use. I mean, imagine a military trying to do something like that. That's not how they do those. Now, there's some that are designed for that, but the vast majority, probably over 98% of them, aren't designed to do that. They're meant to be dropped from an airplane, put in a missile, and dropped from space, or a cruise missile. They have parameters. That's why the sensors themselves, if you want something to explode at 10,000 feet, it will know where it's at 10,000 feet, because it can determine the altitude. If you want an air burst, if you want a ground burst, but maybe right before it hits the ground, instead of it having to actually hit the ground, because if it hits the ground, then it breaks and it doesn't work. that's one thing. If it hits the ground or explodes right before it hits the ground, that's another thing. So these are the kind of things that if a nuclear terrorist wanted to just steal a bomb off the shelf and then use it, it has to get past these things. And the fascinating thing is that bomb makers themselves, people who actually build these things, know how a bomb works, but they don't know how these things are supposed to go off from the arming sequences. The people who are in a B-52 ready to launch one of these bombs, they may know the arming sequence, but they don't know the internal mechanisms of how these things are supposed to work.
Right.
You compartmentalize all these different stuff so that one person...
Which is the aim, right? So you can
So no one person can use it.
Yeah.
That way you have to go through all these different steps because these are very dangerous things. So that's why it's funny how this would actually work. So Stephen Younger, who is a big expert who works on these kind of issues and has written a number of books on this, the quote that I like to say is, he says, there are only a few people in the world who have the knowledge that can cause an unauthorized detonation or nuclear weapon. You can't just grab one off the shelf and enter a code and make it go boom. It doesn't work like that. Now,
except in the movies.
But maybe they had an expert hacker on the staff that was able to hack into these individual systems and work on that. Okay. I mean, it makes it for entertaining purposes. Okay. But it's just funny that an ICBM-launched warhead would have an ignition key. Right. Seems kind of odd. Also, you wouldn't want to have your launch thing to be just a key. Now, there are keys to...
I lose my keys all the time.
You lose your keys all the time.
And,
people can steal keys.
Good thing I'm not in the ranks of nuclear personnel.
But that's why you
Joel,
always...
where's your keys? Left them at home.
Jerry's got them.
Jerry's got them.
But I don't know. I mean, that's why sometimes you have things being stolen from the Soviet Union because the U.S. audiences can always just assume that the Soviets didn't really have their stuff together. So that's why this thing works the way it does, is because they're crazy.
Okay. Now, another thing I want to ping you on is after the first bomb goes off, we then have the big scene on the highway where the Harrier jets, and this was one of the key things, if I remember correctly, that made the movie so expensive, where they actually did blow up this highway, and then they proceeded to rebuild it and then blow it up again for additional shots.
Yeah, we saw this when we saw this when we drove down the coast or down the Keys in our convertible.
You saw the aftermath.
Well, my wife was very upset because I kept yelling, "The bridge is out" every couple of miles, and I think she just wanted to.
It was just lost on her.
She just wanted to watch the sunset,
but not on this audience.
Hope not.
Yep. So during that scene, they not only shoot these vans that are holding 2 of the remaining 3 warheads, they also proceed to shoot missiles at them, blow up the trucks.
But it's okay because Tom Arnold says it's fine.
Right. Well, yeah. So there's this little exchange with the guys in the jets who are like, "Hey, if we shoot this thing, those things aren't going to go off." And they're like, "Oh no, it's fine." And then there's like a little look between Tom Arnold's character and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they're like,
As said by someone that wants to fire a missile at something.
Right. And can I just say, if you guys are leading the effort to save the United States from 3 remaining nuclear blasts, and you guys don't even know if they're going to go off, that's kind of
scary,
a little unsettling. So I'm just curious, shooting a missile, shooting a bunch of bullets from a jet. What's that going to do if it's hitting a nuclear blast? I know in action movies, you shoot a car, you shoot any vehicle with one single bullet anywhere. You can shoot the tire. That thing is blowing up, especially in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. But apparently, it does not mean a nuclear bomb will go off. So I'm curious, how do I reconcile those two?
I think this is an issue that a lot of people have thought about for a long period of time. When we first had when the first 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, the people piloting the planes were concerned that this would go off because of how much of a hair trigger some of these things might have had. They since then have worked through this and have tried to modernize the firing mechanism for a lot of, at least in the United States, the warheads. There was a concern that warheads, if they were hit by lightning, it would set off the conventional explosions that cause a nuclear bomb to go off. So it all depends on the type of bomb design that you have. Uranium-based bombs that are purely uranium tend to be made what's called a gun design. These things, to be able to go off, you need to have a critical mass of the fissile material. Those things you don't want to store in critical mass size. And what that means is like compact close enough with a certain percentage of the weapons grade uranium. You need to have that small and compact so that once you hit the first neutron, that separates the uranium atom, and it causes more neutrons to be separated and fired about. Well, atoms are very small. There's lots of open space. You want to compact those things as closely as possible. You do other things called a tamper to be able to make it so that when a neutron leaves the area, it bounces back and stays in that area so that these things can constantly go off. That's what's called criticality. You want to be able to have one neutron destroy or to break apart one atom, and that causes more neutrons to come out, so then it exponentially grows. That one does two, that two does. Basically, it's like a reverse pyramid scheme. You have one person that gets two, each of them get two. A chain reaction. So you don't store these things, these types of uranium molecules and your compact area. You don't store them in a critical mass because then anything can set them off, even maybe spontaneous fission that occurs. So you keep these things in a gun design. What that means is one critical mass, subcritical mass is fired into another subcritical mass. It puts them compact together. At that right moment, you introduce some neutrons, igniter into it, and then boom, the bomb goes off. So that's one design. The other design is this implosion design that's tend to be used with a combination of either plutonium or uranium. It looks a lot like a soccer ball. There are lots of these really high, sensitive, highly tuned, conventional explosions that are packaged around it. So I say soccer ball because if you look at one of these things, you have the uranium and plutonium cores in the middle, and then you have these patches of explosions around the outside. They're all meant to go off at roughly the same time in a certain pattern to compact something from like the size of a soccer ball to the size of a golf ball. And then once it's in that tight packed area, then you introduce a neutron and that sets it off. So a lot of the concerns people have is that anything that can set off a conventional explosion, like maybe some lightning that triggers the igniter.
Or a missile from a Harrier jet while it's being driven at 80 miles an hour on a highway in the Florida Keys.
And then falls into the ocean.
You know, just one scenario.
So these are all concerns people have. But there's a difference between a nuclear bomb, one, exploding without actually what's called criticality. It doesn't actually explode to the full yield that it's supposed to go to. If you take a nuclear warhead and you hit it with a missile, it may not actually cause a gigantic explosion you see with a mushroom cloud, but it might still explode, causing radioactive material to fly.
Which would then become...
That's a big concern.
That would be, in all practicality, what people refer to as a dirty bomb, right?
Yeah.
Where
it's
you
a version
blow
of a
up
dirty
the
bomb,
material, and then... So, you know, you may not have the nuclear explosion, but you'd have a nuclear cleanup.
Right. And there's other questions. We'll get to a movie with dirty bombs in it later on, but dirty bombs tend to be had because uranium itself is not a very good thing to put in a dirty bomb because its half-life isn't so great. It's not as dangerous as other stuff. So you put things like cesium. That's the really dangerous stuff.
Oh, gotta watch
that you
out
want to
for
put in there. Plutonium would do the trick too. But like things like a lightning strike, people were concerned about that this would cause an explosion too. So, yeah, I mean... Would hitting a nuclear bomb with a missile maybe set it off? Maybe, probably not. These things have a lot of safeguards. There's an example of a big accident that occurred in North Carolina where a giant jet accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb that was armed, or maybe I forget it was armed or not armed, but a number of the safeguards, something along the lines of like 20 out of 23 of them failed, but the bomb still didn't go off, and that was dropped from an airplane, and they were able to recover some of that. Maybe some of them actually haven't been recovered. There's all kinds of examples. There's an example in Greenland where one of our jets that was carrying one of these things just crashed into an iceberg, and they've never been able to find it. Or some sort of – so these things happen a lot.
Sleep at night well, my friends.
Yeah, they don't always go
Sleep
off,
tight.
but that's certainly a concern. They try to make these things safer so that the only time they actually go off is when you want them to. But it doesn't make for exciting movies, though. So probably what would have happened is they would have recovered the warhead. They would have had to do some stuff. The ones that fell that were hit by the bomb, the missiles from the Harrier jet, they probably would have recovered those things, and I'm sure they would say that they were fine. But it's certainly a worry. But whether or not they would actually go off to have a mushroom cloud like that, it's probably okay.
Much like the movie. Little shrug.
It's like, yeah, I
Continue on. We got some more terrorists
It's how you have to weigh it. You have to weigh the chance that it gets away and then it actually goes off.
Well, that's true.
Versus somewhere along the Keys.
Which would really the highway.
It would devastate the Key West economy if people couldn't go down there to get their key lime pies anymore. They have to build a new bridge.
Interesting to talk about nuclear weapons that do disappear. I believe they refer to those as broken arrows.
Broken arrows, although in this movie they called it a bright boy alert.
Bright boy.
I think they just kind of made that up for this. Usually they refer to it. We'll get to that later on in some other movie, but broken arrow is usually the term that we refer to as something, some sort of missile or nuclear-related component that's missing and could potentially go off. But one thing I want to talk about is the idea of nuclear terrorism. because this movie, it's obviously a major big plot of it, and then. I mean, Joel, you read the summary of what the French movie was based off of, which is kind of interesting and timely given some of the stuff that's been going on in Paris right now.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I just did some quick Googling just to get a little more background on it, and it actually, the original French film mirrors the True Lies adaptation. I mean, it was almost like a truthful retelling of that story. I mean, down to the used car salesman having the apparent affair with his wife and things like that. The one interesting thing is that I hadn't seen any mention of nuclear weapons involved, but apparently the final target was going to be a Paris stadium for a bomb attack. So it was interesting, thinking about it, from the original film being potentially just a conventional bombing attack at a stadium and kind of kicking it up a notch to a nuclear weapon with terrorists in the United States. I just wondered, was that kind of Hollywood doing its thing of trying to amp it up. It's Arnold Schwarzenegger, so you got to kick it up a notch, and what better way to kick it up a notch from a conventional bomb? But got to go with a nuclear weapon. I haven't heard anything or seen any interviews with Cameron confirming that, but I've got a microphone, so I'm going to go ahead and just wonder, was that maybe an instinctive or some kind of reflex in Hollywood to really kick it up a notch, have a nuclear weapon?
Well, the idea of nuclear terrorism or a non-state actor, someone that's not a state using a nuclear weapon to get some sort of political or just murder people, some sort of political objective, whatever their objective happens to be, it's been around. This concern for quite a while. Oppenheimer, when the first bomb went off, he even said something along the lines of, if 3 or 4 men could smuggle in units for an atomic bomb, they could destroy New York. This was something that a guy, Brian Jenkins, who wrote this article, big terrorism expert, wrote an article, International Terrorism, A New Kind of Warfare, in 1974, where he talked about the world's increasing independence on nuclear power may provide terrorists with weapons of mass destruction. So it's something that people have certainly been thinking about for quite a while. But, I mean, it is a real debate about whether or not terrorists have been trying to get nuclear weapons, have even want to be able to do it, and how easy it would be to be able to get their hands on it. That's why I would say most of the people, the experts that look at this, are worried about a large-scale nuclear bomb, but they're really worried about these dirty bomb issues. Smugglers recently, there's an AP article that last couple of months saw that there were these in Moldova. They were able to run a sting operation of radioactive materials that were being smuggled out of Russia into various hands of people that wanted to buy these things. Some which the AP report that I saw talked about even ISIS being one of the potential buyers for these kind of materials. There were reports in the 9/11 Commission that said Al-Qaeda was trying to be interested in trying to look for a nuclear bomb or some sort of radioactive material. These things are up in the air about whether or not how true some of these actual sources are, but it's certainly been a question that people look about. So you have to think about, like, what is the objective about using one of these things? Is it to kill as many people as possible? Mm-hmm. Is it to or to instill panic, which is a lot of what a dirty bomb would do? It wouldn't kill as many people as a full-scale nuclear bomb, but it would certainly have a lot of panic. You set one of these things off in New York City, and months and months and months, these areas, before they're cleaned up, cannot be used. And the concern people would have about what the next thing might be, where it would go off, the economic impact it would have, these are things that you can get with a dirty bomb, which really have been a big focus of U.S. operations to be able to secure nuclear material. This has been President Obama's big deal with the nuclear security summits. It's not just about weapons. It's about nuclear and radioactive material sources, things you find in hospitals with radioactive sources, or things we used to use in nuclear power or nuclear research reactors. Why do you need to use highly enriched uranium as opposed to low enriched uranium? Where do you keep these things? Are they secure? These are all the concerns that people have been having and have been looking about for quite a while. So you figure out how you be able to prevent terrorists from getting the access to these materials. Access is usually the thing that people look at. Can't always have Arnold come in and save the day, as much as we wish we could.
He's still going, man.
But yeah, I mean, that's during the 90s. Yeah, he's still going along strong.
He's got free time.
Especially as a time-traveling robot. So in the 90s, there was the Nunn-Lugar program, which was about Senator Nunn and Senator Lugar trying to be able to secure some of these materials from the former Soviet states. And then recently, though, that program was very successful in securing material. Some of the stuff that I used to work on was the global partnership against the spread of weapons and material of mass destruction. Another one of these kind of efforts that the G8 was putting together before Russia was kicked out of the G8, to be able to take things like nuclear submarines. Russia had all of these nuclear submarines that were degrading. They had material in them. They had to be able to figure out how to be able to secure those things. These are things that the United States is focused on, and its partners, and Russia itself has expressed a lot of concern about this. But now, with Nunn-Lugar expiring and the global partnership not working very well, where are they going to do? How are they going to be able to manage this stuff is certainly a question people have.
So, going back to kind of where the movie was, when it was, where we are today, just talking about movies, outside of the substance of the nuclear issue, that movie was out in 1994. I read some background information that they had discussed a sequel, that they'd even worked up a potential screenplay that, was kind of in the can, ready to go if the stars aligned between Arnold and all the others, as well as the other kind of movie-making logistics that are required.
This was before Arnold became governor of California?
Right. I assume so, presumably. But the interesting question is, could that movie, either the first one or the sequel, be made today? And I did see a quote, and I should say I have not double-checked any of these quotes or mentions that because why do I need to do that? You guys can do that.
It's a free podcast.
Yeah, feel free to correct us. That's an interactive portion. Anyways, James Cameron was quoted as saying that the sequel never happened because, especially after 9/11, terrorism just isn't as funny anymore. And I must confess that, I laughed at first at that, just how, he laid it very bare that, audiences have changed in how they view movies. And after 9/11, all sorts of things changed, especially in pop culture and things like that. And, it made me think of, if I think of movies that I've seen recently or even the last 5-10 years, when I think of an entire city being put at risk, things like that, some giant explosive device, I can't think of many movies where it's been because of a rogue terrorist group that may resemble, elements of, real-life terrorist groups. But instead, it's certain comic book movies or other kind of sci-fi bad guys, which are a little further afield of what we see in reality today. And so I wonder, is it maybe more palatable to have that same sense of world annihilation or city-wide danger if it's because of an alien attack or some type of supervillain attack, but it may be harder to get a movie made today, like True Lies in 1994, if it resembles reality a little too much.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Certainly a lot of the comedy element of that. There's certainly been action movies, I think, where I'm sure we'll do Mission Impossible 4, Ghost Protocol, where that was a nuclear weapon that was stolen, and then they had to get the codes to be able to launch those weapons, or at least weapons wasn't stolen. I remember that. They had a weapon that they wanted to get the launch sequence to be able to fire one of these things. So, but those aren't terrorists necessarily in terms of what we think about those kind of things. I certainly do terrorizing-like activities. That guy wanted to launch a bomb to start a war.
But I believe he was even some kind of ex-Nazi or something like that.
Well, that was Some of All Fears. See, a lot of these things kind of blend together. I think this guy was a Russian nuclear strategist, which is pretty funny to think about. A former academic nuclear strategist wanting to start a war. So I think you alternate kind of where you go with these stuff. But if these movies are made, I think you're right. James Cameron is right. They're not funny anymore unless they're just over-the-top hilarious. This kind of movie, True Lies, fit this action mold as well as a comedy mold. It's interesting. I don't know if it could be made nowadays. It certainly would be made. You couldn't make a movie about Paris being under a terrorist attack or bombing a stadium just yet. I'm sure someone will make that eventually, but these kind of things might be a little sensitive for this point.
And so I almost wonder, True Lies, I think, still holds up in many ways.
It was still pretty entertaining,
from the effects, because, obviously they did a lot of...
It won an Oscar.
Yeah, they did more physical effects. So just from a movie-making standpoint, it holds up, unlike many other movies, I think, that you see that maybe rely too much on computer graphics or things like that.
Well, I think it's certainly interesting, and especially the idea of nuclear terrorism. I'm sure that's a motif that we'll see in a lot of the movies that we'll cover.
Right.
The idea about whether or not a terrorist would even want to go after a nuclear bomb, because these things are really hard to steal an existing nuclear warhead and smuggle those things out. Because once a nuclear bomb itself, a full-scale, ready-to-go bomb, is something that people care a lot about, making sure that no one steals it. Nuclear radioactive material, things you would steal from a hospital or from a research reactor, those kind of things, that might be a little bit easier to steal. So it depends on the terrorist organization's risk-adverse nature. Some of them might be willing to say, we could get the same impact from a dirty bomb, or we can get the same impact from having some people with AK-47s running around the street blowing people up. The idea of going for the big bomb with a nuclear weapon, it's hard. There's a lot of steps that could go wrong. Some of the concepts that we'll talk about in future movies, like, it's not simply a question of the terrorist organization only has to succeed once, and the United States has to succeed every single time to be able to prevent them. It's true, sure, but the logic also gets inverted, and this is a major concept of a book that I'll recommend at the end called On Nuclear Terrorism by Michael Levi in 2007. It's also reverse logic. At every step within a plot, terrorists need to get it right every single time, because each one of those steps
to get to that
they could get caught. Yeah, exactly. So these are complicated endeavors that go through. So whether or not a nuclear bomb is something that a terrorist organization would use for whatever objective they want to get, because there's also ideas, if you fire off a nuclear bomb in a city, it indiscriminately kills a great number of people. You may lose support from people that you may have been able to get. This humanitarian idea that Crimson Jihad had, you may lose a lot of support, but it may also be a fledgling, like Islamic State, a nuclear power or a terrorist organization that wants to be able to prove that it's on the international stage and is a big deal. Maybe a nuclear bomb is a way to do that. So it depends on what the objective is. So I think it's interesting that a movie like this, could it be made now? Maybe, but because I think it depends on whether or not how the public, people that actually watch these things, understand nuclear terrorism. People probably haven't thought about how hard it is to get these things and to go off. They just have seen movies where it's a plot device that James Bond is in charge of stopping. So it could understand it being made nowadays because it's something that people are used to.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I thought it was pretty good. I think that movie still holds up regardless of the nuclear nonsense that takes place there. I would say that this is a good movie, and I would probably recommend it to people.
Oh, definitely. We were talking about this as we were watching some of the scenes where Arnold's trying to be funny, and by and large, I would say he succeeded, especially with Tom Arnold. I mean, I think people underestimate just how critical he was to making the ridiculousness of Arnold being kind of a mild-mannered computer salesman kind of work.
I don't know why this wasn't a breakout role for him.
Exactly. But I think, there are other Arnold movies where it does not work. And I think just in terms of his sense of humor and things like that. But I felt like with this one, they got it right where from the beginning to the end, there is a sense of danger and, the typical action movie, like going back to the days of Commando and, all that stuff.
Jingle all the way.
Right, exactly. But starting to move into that stage of Arnold being able to kind of laugh at himself, not take himself too seriously. And he got the right balance. Maybe later movies, he took himself, he went a little too far into the comedy, Jingle all the way.
I'm sure we'll probably won't get to Kindergarten Cop, but it's definitely right on our minds. I mentioned On Nuclear Terrorism by Michael Levi, which is a good rundown of the type of defense systems that we have or should set up to be able to address nuclear terrorism. But there's two other books that can have competing ideas on this that I think it's good to recommend, so you don't just watch the entertaining stuff, but you also learn a little bit. Nuclear Terrorism: The Ultimate Preventable Catastrophe by Graham T. Allison in 2004. That was a book that is very concerned about nuclear terrorism threats and predicting whether or not these things are going to be in our reality and in our actual day-to-day threat concerns. Then you have the other side of this, which is Atomic Obsession by John Mueller in 2010. He disagrees with the threat of nuclear terrorism. Certainly it would be bad if it happened, but it's, by his perspective, a very largely overstated and exaggerated threat, all the steps that have to go into it, things we talked about earlier. So that's the first episode. We hope you enjoyed listening. We're going to try to make each episode better than the last, but in order to do that, except for being able to solve any sort of audio problems, we'll work on that on our own end. We want to hear from you. You have any ideas about what kind of movies or TV shows we should watch, or any sort of guest to bring on to talk about these kind of things with us? Please let us know. You can reach out to us on Facebook at facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. We're also on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast. And email, of course. Email us at supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you and see what you guys think about this. We'll try to announce our next movie ahead of time on Facebook or Twitter, so you can submit questions to us for areas to cover. And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we're bound to get super critical about it. See you next time.